What's up, my Cracker Tugas? MBT here. Let's talk about Invoke runes. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave you a beginner's guide to counter runes, the back row that makes up a majority of Elestrals decks. And it's usually the same 4 or 5 pieces of back row most of the time. A couple of you voiced in the comments that you wanted to see a similar guide to Invoke runes, so I am here to do that for you today. Invoke runes, if you're unfamiliar, are the equivalent of spells in Elestrals. While counter runes punish an opponent for overextending, a la trap cards, Invoke runes further your own plays, remove your opponent's Elestrals, or sometimes perform stupid, dumb, additional ancillary functions that we'll get to them. We'll get to them. So let me give you a quick once-over of what you're likely to see in any given event. And we'll begin with the commonly played ones. First up is Ambro. Ambrosia is in every single deck. It's in every single deck, usually at 3 copies, 2 if you're being incredibly greedy, and it's not hard to see why. In most other card games, heal spells are completely unplayable. It doesn't matter if you have 8,000 life points or 1, as long as you're winning the board state. But in Elestrals, your health is also your capacity to cast cards. So frequently, games will come down to not who is winning the board, but who has the capacity to keep putting things on it. And almost always, the answer is the person who finds more of this specific card. Coder has likened Ambrosia to Maxi, which is certifiably insane, but it's also probably true that the individual who finds more Ambro from their opponent is in a really advantageous position. But Ambrosia's utility isn't just limited to the text on the card. The fact that Ambrosia is a 1-cost rune that you can activate pretty much any time during the game means you can do some really heinous stuff with it. Frequently, you'll get into a position where you're a little ahead of an opponent and re-enchant an Astrabbit on your second turn. If your opponent hasn't committed to the board state, they're telegraphing a card like Lavalith, which would massively punish your setup. But if you cast Ambrosia using the spirit that's already on the Astrabbit, well, guess what? You actually don't have to worry about it at all. Ambrosia lets you get away with a little bit of boy math in your spirit deck. It's become fashionable in decks that play 3 copies of Earthquake and no other Earth enchanting Elestrals to just play 2 total copies and hope to find Ambro before you find the second Earthquake. And in decks with a lot of filtering, think everything that plays Astrabbit, it's a really fantastic late game tool to find off a selection of cards. Next up is Earthquake. Earthquake is the premier removal spell in the game. And when building a deck, you have to have a pretty good reason if you intend not to include this individual card. There's a reasonable amount of conditional removal that we'll get into momentarily, but this is the only card that just straight up says on it, blow that creature straight to hell. There's a number of Towers monsters in Elestrals, but none of them really circumvent the utility of this card. Or there's some stuff in here that resists counter runes, but doesn't resist just getting killed by this card. It's one of the best answers to turn 1 Astrabbit as well, and unlike cards like Boombat, it's a way to make a huge board swing without having to commit an Elestral of your own. EQ's great. Most people run it at 2 or 3 copies, and then play 2 to 4 copies of Taratlus in the Spirit deck, depending on how much boy math they've done. Next up is Resting on Your Laurels. Resting on your laurels is kind of a bit of an affront to God. It's a testament to the fact that people will do anything to cut exactly 1 spirit's worth of payment on a card. Laurels can only be cast if your opponent is up spirits on you by 2 on field, and then it targets and destroys the Elestral your opponent controls with the fewest enchanting spirits. There's a lot of scenarios where this kinda sucks, like frequently your opponent will have way more enchanting spirits than you because they have a big guy out, and you're forced to go for the little guy before the big guy. But as Josh would say, this card is always live. Yes, people can play around this card to the best of their ability, but in so doing, they are restricting their own movement, and as a result, you're going to see some results. This card is also really good when you are really behind. Frequently, you'll get into a position where like your opponent has fulfilled the condition on something like a Lavalith and a Resting on Your Laurels, and you can live the dream and like Laurels, follow up Lavalith, or like Laurels, EQ, just wipe the whole fucking field. It's nice. And frequently opponents will get into a position where they only have 1 big ass guy on their field. Think someone they've just ascended to, a Celestleo or something. Many decks elect to main deck Resting, but almost all of them play it somewhere in their list, either in the main or the side. And finally, let's talk about Nectar of the Gods. So Nectar of the Gods is pretty frequently played, but not always. It's just draw 2 cards. There's a lot of scenarios where this card is amazing. Early in the game when fighting for the board is really important, it's incredible to be able to outpace your opponent with 2 additional cards, meaning you can get away with playing some of your counter runes a little suboptimally, or having a better quality of general Elestral you are performing combat with. It's of course right at home in combo decks that just need to see more cards, but it is so bad late. Sometimes it's like turn 15 and you draw a Nectar and you go, I can't cast that. And in really tight lists with interchangeable Elestrals like 5s, sometimes it doesn't make the cut at all. You're just going to draw more 5s. You've got 5s already. Your whole hand is 5s. With that, let's move into a discussion of some less played Invoke runes. First up, we're going to talk about 4 removal spells, beginning with Cryoblast. This past weekend was Cryoblast's big break, its first attempt at competitive success after its release in Daybreak, and it's good. Again, people will pay through the nose for a 1-cost removal spell, and this one doesn't hit everything, but it does hit a lot of things. Most of the attacking critters that are being played do not have 2 defense, and so Cryoblast will just shrink an Eris or an Eddy. It doesn't have to kill the critter either. You can activate this on something like an Astrabbit and then just get over it with like a Spectaris. A lot of use cases for this card, and it helps that no one's playing Frost. Next up is Race to the Top. God, we're gonna go through every 1-spirit removal spell under the sun? Race to the Top is a lot of the reason that Thunder Nexus was almost unbeatable in Frostfall meta pre-Sparkit ban. This card's insanely good in decks that are playing Mount Olympus, and theoretically those exist. Target Rabbit, target one of your Elestrals, 6 is bigger than whatever you're packing. This card's good enough that some individuals are splashing it in decks where it like clearly doesn't belong, throwing like a Jolton package into Windburn because like Toxion also burns and Elechic's natively good and you might as well play a removal spell. At present, Thunder doesn't feel like a super playable Pantheon, but once it becomes one again, you can guarantee you're going to see this everywhere. Next up is Rock in a Hard Place. So I thought this card was bad, and it turns out it's okay. Listen, if you're going to play a 2-mana removal spell, you might as well play Earthquake. But Rock in a Hard Place has pretty good spirits attached to it. A lot of decks want to play water for obvious reasons. Tsunami, Eddy, Misenchanting to play around Tsunami. And a lot of decks want to play Lunar because Spectaris exists and they might be splashing. The text on this card isn't fantastic. Giving your opponent agency isn't wonderful. But frequently it does put them between a rock and a hard place. A pretty reasonable turn 1 board is an Astrabbit and a single counter rune in the back row. You rock in a hard place that, and well, they're going to lose the Astrabbit one way or another. Just get a big enough guy on field. What's more, Eddy is so individually powerful that you might just force him in the same deck as this card and plop out a Kuribis sometimes. Some wet 5s decks are experimenting with this, and I think it's okay. It's going to get a lot better October 1st. Finally, let's talk about 2 runes that pop cards, Thunderbolt and Blizzard. I think these cards are way better than people give them credit for. At present, there aren't a lot of ways to destroy back row. Lavalith does it, but realistically, he probably just trades for the back row that he's targeting. Brummelinx sorta does it. It's just nice sometimes to have an unconditional removal spell. These 2 don't see a lot of play, but they theoretically could. They're probably not at their best if you're just using them to snipe Tsunamis, but in scenarios where you can expect your opponent to sit on like a 3 enchanted Aeolus, I could see them coming up a lot. Depends on the meta. Next up is dumb, fucking stupid ass combo pieces. First up is Rise from the Ashes. All right, this one's Wayward's fault. Rise from the Ashes is a monster reborn that costs you somewhere between 4 and 6 spirits. It's playable in Monarch because you occasionally get to cast it for free off of Arcalith, and it's playable in that awful Wurtz brew that tries to cheat out Farrageist because Farrageist is a good card. But people don't splash for this. I'll just throw a 1/5 of the game into the toilet to Astrabbit twice. And if Ambrosia was so good, where's Ambrosia 2? This is playable in fruit decks at present. Drataya having 6 targets is a lot different than Drataya having 3 targets. But decks aren't splashing for this either. It's just in unfair strategies that are trying to draw their whole deck. They better not print Ambro 3. And finally, Eruption. Eruption is a really hard card to place. It feels really dog-ass like 99% of the time, but then you just randomly win a game with it and you think, I gotta be playing Eruption. At present, there's enough cards that synergize with Eruption that it feels like maybe it's worth considering. Like if you search it and then burn your opponent out, it feels a lot less bad than just trying to sack them with it. Against certain matchups, they go really, really low, really, really early, think Wind. But in general, it's not something you have to play around until you see it. And that's that. All the Invoke runes you're going to have to worry about at present. There's some corner cases where other ones are going to come up, but I guarantee you if something not on this list shows up in front of you, your opponent's going to be completely fine with you picking it up and reading it. All right, that's it. You guys want to hear about the good Elestrals next? I don't know. Bye.